Today's teenagers live in a far different world than the one in which their parents were raised. Find out what you can do to help your teenager move through adolescence into a successful adulthood tonight on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. Tonight we're taking your questions on parenting teenagers, a topic that may include discussions of adult themes. Now, last week you did an excellent job of calling in questions, and so I have expectations that you'll do just as good this week. Don't let me down. Call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. You can also text us your questions or email them using the number or address listed at the bottom of your screen. Let's start by introducing our guest tonight. Sabrina Matheny is a licensed clinical social worker with the Human Development Center, where she directs the trauma team and the school-based Children's Mental Health Services program. She's also one of the Duluth News Tribune's top 20 under 40 honorees. Dan D'Allard, Dr. Dan D'Allard, is a licensed clinical psychologist with the Duluth Psychological Clinic, where he specializes in the psychological assessment and treatment of children and adolescents. And Jane Larson is a certified prevention professional with the Human Development Center's Superior Office, where for the past 15 years she's worked as the coordinator of Project Reach Out, a program that serves at-risk, runaway, and homeless teens. Thanks to all of you for being here this evening. And I think maybe before we start about parenting teenagers, just to give parents some context about this, we should have a little discussion about what the job of parenting maybe an 8 to 12-year-old involves. And Sabrina, I think I'll start with you since you're the top 20 under 40.
Well, I think 8 to 12 is really a nice age. Kids are starting to become more independent. They're starting to have some responsibilities. And so it's a great time for parents to start to let kids carry some of that responsibility, engage in task, homework by themselves, start to plan and be responsible for, gathering everything they need, coordinating their social events, and things of that nature. And then also letting kids kind of have some of those natural consequences, so that parents can somewhat step back a little bit and try to help kids understand kind of how the world works, let them, try things out. And they're still doing things that are pretty safe and pretty under control. So it's a great time to start laying the foundation for some of those later and more independent tasks of adolescence.
So this little tastes of freedom then is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, Dan, I hear a lot of parents talk about that 8 to 12-year-old is almost their favorite time of their kid, that kids are still in that kind of loving mode towards their parents.
That's right.
Talk to us a little bit about that part of parenting the 8 to 12-year-old and what the kids are like during that age.
That's right. Often in that age range, kids have figured some things out, right? They figured out where mom and dad's limits are. They figured out whether they want to test those limits and under what circumstances. And they've got some more emotional competence than they had, say prior to age 8. And they're not yet in the adolescent phase of looking more to their peer group than their family for social interactions. So they understand where they stand vis-a-vis mom and dad. They have emotional competence, and they are still channeling their social energies within the family. And it often is, it's a delightful time.
So that's kind of this 8 to 12-year-old time, and then 13 hits. Mm-hmm. And now we're into the teenage years, and we're into puberty, and if we're into puberty, we're into hormones that go along with puberty. What are the things that begin to happen just with kids? And Jane, I'll go to you. kids as teenagers, how do kids as teenagers begin to evolve differently from that preteen age?
I think one of the biggest shifts is that as they start to go into those teen years, like Dan mentioned, in the earlier years they're really focused on their family still, and that's, you know, their main socialization still happens and occurs within the family. And as they shift into those teen years, their peer group becomes more important. They're trying to do that, separate from their parents a little more, become more individual, and their peers and what is important to their friends becomes more important than what mom and dad maybe want for them and what they've been doing at home. And that's one of the biggest shifts that happens.
And I think what I've noticed too, just in talking with parents in my practice, is that as the peer group becomes more centralized to a child's social life, the parents all of a sudden start noticing maybe a little bit more, who are you hanging around with, and start having maybe some concerns about that, Sabrina, that they didn't have before. What have you noticed about that?
Absolutely. I think that as you enter that 13, 14-year-old time frame, that certainly kids are spending more time with their friends. They're also doing things with their friends, and some of the stuff they're doing starts to get a little bit more risky, and we see that influence towards, you know, kids who are engaging in maybe just the starting of negative behavior, like skipping a class or some of that, and I think parents get worried that their kids are going to follow that, or, you know, children who may be more or less respectful to their parents, and worrying that their child is going to start to pick up some of those habits to fit in with the crowd and do things that they would wish their child wasn't going to do.
And so then you mentioned that starting to do those things that are a little bit more risky, which I think is what makes parents gulp. It makes you gulp out there, right? I had a parent, a friend of mine, who has kids this high, and she said, "I'm not ready to watch that show." But I think what they're jumping ahead to are those kinds of risks. Let's sort of name some of those risks that make parents really anxious.
Sure, there's so many of them. Where do we start, unfortunately? The risks of associating with peers who themselves have bad habits, the risks of a premature sexual behavior, the risks of substance use, the risks of other sort of risk-taking behaviors as teens start to drive, for example, thinking more of the gas pedal than the brake, etc. So all sorts of things that increase the opportunities for consequences that teens are not emotionally, socially, psychologically equipped to deal with. Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting that there are good brain-based reasons why teens are drawn to those behaviors, right? The parts of the brain that are very reward-dependent, that are impulsive, that are risk-taking, are getting a lot of chemical attention at this time in adolescence, and the brakes don't work as well as they ought to. So teens are drawn to those sorts of behaviors because their body's urging them in that direction. It's not always a moral failure.
I think that you raise a really important point that is helpful for parents to know too, which is that some of what they're seeing is a biochemical relationship between that gets manifested in that sort of the brain chemistry gets manifested into the behavior that they're seeing. And all of you out there right now, go out and buy the latest issue of National Geographic, because the cover story is on the teenage brain. And that story does a really nice job of highlighting that teenagers are more reward focused as opposed to motivated by consequences, whereas we adults tend to think about consequences and weigh that a little bit with rewards. Talk a little bit, Jane, in terms of what you see with some of the kids that you work with that whole notion of that reward focus.
It's exactly like Dan said. They're really, focused on what things that are stimulating to them, and that tends to be risky sometimes for the kids in their behavior. They watch movies, and sometimes they're going out imitating things that they see. They're engaging in behavior without the forethought to think ahead to what the consequences could be or might be. And it's very much like you said. It's they've gotten into a car, and their foot's on the gas pedal, and it's like they don't know that there's a brake or how to use a brake, and so they're engaging in behaviors that put them at risk for harm, And, we have to, as parents, one of the things I tell parents often is that this is a time, as much as you want to be a friend to your child, you really have to be the parent, and sometimes you have to be the person who says no, and you have to put the brakes on for your child because they're not thinking that way at all. And so they tend to do all of these things that sound fun and that are exciting and give them a thrill. And we have to help protect them by saying no and being the brake in their car for them.
I really like that conceptualization that the child is the gas pedal, the teenager is the gas pedal, the parent is the brake. Sabrina, you were going to say something.
Well, and I think that becomes where it's important to start practice setting those limits at 8 to 12. Because then when you get to the bigger, behaviors that have more risk and the limits are more important, you've had a basis of setting limits, and kids have had an understanding, like Dan mentioned, about where the parents' limits are and how to interact with that. So.
I have a question here from Megan in Duluth, who asks, there's a lot of drama between my daughter and me, and so I'm assuming Megan is the mother. How and we're with you in spirit, Megan, here. There's a lot of drama between my daughter and me. How can I reduce the tension? Dan?
How do you reduce the tension? I think part of what you do is you remind yourself that part of the adolescent's task is to be dramatic, is to test out these new cognitive and emotional and social abilities, and to not get distracted too much by the drama. And a rule of thumb I often discuss with parents is to, of course, pick your battles. And how do you do that? Well, you often go soft on style and preference issues, and you go harder on issues of safety and respect. So if your drama is around what are you wearing, unless it's terribly obviously inappropriate, I'd go soft on something like that, and I'd go harder on issues related to safety, driving, substance use, etc., and issues of respect for other people. That's one approach.
So a teenager with lime green hair who doesn't try to text while they're driving, that's a way better situation than the nice, clean-cut, haircut boy who is texting like crazy when he's driving, right? And that just kind of brings to mind too, is that this real balance that we have with that 8 to 12-year-olds time where you're still kind of holding on and holding the child in. And what I hear in my practice from parents is, you mean I'm supposed to let go right when they start doing all of these dangerous things? So Jane, maybe you could comment on that. How does a parent even begin to do that? Because now the stakes have jumped.
The stakes have jumped, and I think Sabrina talked about, when in that 8 to 12-year-old range, you start laying the foundation for that, hopefully during those years, so that you are able to set some boundaries, you have some rules, you have laid some ground rules, and you need to still have ground rules. We're not giving them free rein when they turn 13, like go do whatever you'd like to. And we need to be the brakes, so we need to give them that some freedom, and when they can show they're responsible with it, then we give them a little bit more. And it's difficult for parents, I think. It's a really hard time because it's exactly what we've just all been saying. Things are changing for them, they're changing, and they just want to go, and we're saying, wait a minute, I'm not ready for this. And they're going to go with whether we're ready or not. So it's better to have some rules, a few ground rules laid down, and give them some of that freedom. And if they can be responsible with it, then they've earned that right, and you continue to let go in increments and still know in the back of your mind that you still have to be keeping an eye on things and being prepared to say, no, this is enough now, we need to stop here or back off a little bit.
Here's a message that came to us, a text message that came to us, and that brings to mind, I think we need to talk about technology too. But before we get to that topic, how do you respond to a teen's emotional response to the consequences? So you give a consequence like, Sabrina, give me your phone. And then what we see is, here comes the Academy Award winning performance.
Exactly.
And so how should that parent respond to the emotional outpouring, to the consequence?
This is a challenge for parents, and it's, I think, a challenge for a lot of people in that situation, but it's about kind of ignoring the emotional outburst and just remaining kind of with the same tone of voice, please give me your phone. and not escalating, not trying to soothe, really not engaging, because that storm is going to pass. In most cases, that storm is going to pass, and the child, despite the award-winning performance, will not be scarred for life by having whatever consequence you're giving them.
And you know, I was rereading, there's a wonderful book that I had put in last year's blog, Get Out of My Life, but First Could You Please Take Me and Cheryl to the Mall, which just kind of tells you that you're going to want to go out and buy that book. And it's a parent's guide to raising teenagers. And he talks about this notion that girls, number one, this is my term, girls are the lawyers, boys are the Houdinis. And with that lawyers, there's a lot of arguing, a lot of trying to negotiate, a lot of drama around that. And his point of view is that is that girl's way of trying to stay connected to their parents, that there is this pushing and pulling of, I want to separate, but I still want to stay connected. And the best way for me to stay connected to you is for me to get into a fight with you about that. And I'm wondering if you've noticed that and heard from that in your practice as well.
Too often. Identity issues take center stage in adolescence, and part of the identity question is who's on my team and who isn't, who are my allies and who are not. And some of that arguing is testing how much can I trust that my parents are still on my team, even when I do outrageous things even that seem outrageous to me. Can I trust that my parents are still with me? And even the arguing provides attention. And as we all know, this is even truer for younger children. Negative attention is sometimes better and more reinforcing than no attention at all.
And in fact, you know, when you were describing that the parent should just remain calm and keep setting the limit, I was thinking to myself, oh, you mean just what you do with the toddler? And because it seems like a lot of the same, I think, behavior, and parents, I think, response to that is like, I saw this 10 years ago, only now you're bigger, and maybe an expectation that they should be behaving better.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true, and they're growing up and they're trying new things, and there's some basic skills for parenting that I think remain the same from birth to graduation and beyond as parents. So, you know, we're always a parent, and so one of the things that I always talk to parents about when they're struggling with issues with their children of any age is that if you don't engage with that child, you can't have an argument. If you don't engage, this isn't going to go beyond where it is right now. But when we get emotional as parents, or we're responding in kind, or we are escalating ourselves, the battle is lost right there. There's nobody that's going to win, and this is not going to be a very feel-good situation for anybody. So we have to monitor as parents our own response to our children when in those situations, and maintain that calm and stick to the facts. Sometimes it's being a broken record, repeating the same thing over and over because they want you to say something different or give in, but it's part of that the same thing that you did when they were 2 and 3 and 8 and 9 and 14.
Now, when I introduced the show, I started by saying that kids live in a different world today than the ones in which their parents were raised. And what I'm thinking of as I'm saying that is all of the technology that's available to kids, the cell phones, the computers, and forget all of the computer games even, but even if we just take a look at the cell phones and the iPads and the iPods and the computers, how is this challenging or facilitating parenting, Dan?
Boy, the research I'm familiar with tells us that teenagers spend an average of 5.5 hours a day looking at screens, 3 hours of television, and the rest mixed among the media you just described. Two main challenges I see there. Well, three. One is, what are teens not doing that they developmentally ought to be doing when they're looking at those screens? Are they not interacting face-to-face with peers, developing competencies and skills, practicing the tuba, what have you? The other problem is that media provides a lot of instant gratification. And when teens are coping with brains that are pushing them towards instant gratification, and parents on the other end hopefully are urging them to take a longer perspective on things, the media is clearly on the side of the instant gratification, so it makes the parenting challenge harder. One way it can help is it's another way for parents to stay in touch with teens, new ways to communicate, and that has pros and cons, but it certainly can be a pro.
And what have you found, Sabrina, in your practice?
I'd agree with what Dan said. I also think that some of the other concerns that come up is kids aren't able to understand the risks of the people that they're communicating with online, or they're texting. They may not know who this person is. So I think that's one risk, that there's this element of vulnerability, that kids have a hard time understanding themselves. And I think the other risks become some of the bullying and the kind of sexting and things like that technology has facilitated, that become harmful, and that I think are sometimes hard for kids to stand up to, or for kids to tell adults about.
And so then at what age are we talking? Should kids be having a cell phone, Jane?
Well, when should they? I'd like, personally, I'd like to see them not have a cell phone until much later, when they can, really understand how to use them appropriately and to not have problems with them. But, when I go into the schools and I go into classrooms and we're in grade schools, and I'll ask, how many of you have a cell phone? And you'd be amazed how many kids in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade, 6th grade raise their hand, they have cell phones. Or how many of you have a Facebook account? And their hands go up. And Facebook, technically, anybody under the age of 13 shouldn't be having a Facebook page, but all you have to do is change a birth date and they can get a Facebook page up. So I think really, again, it goes back to parents. Like you would monitor your children with their friends in the neighborhood, are we, as parents, monitoring our children's online lives? Are we watching? Do we check their cell phones to see who they're texting? Do we know who their friends are? And to be prepared to talk to our kids about some of the dangers. There's all kinds of things. I tell especially when I'm in the grade schools, I tell kids, anybody that you meet online is really a stranger, because you don't know, you can't see who, is it really the person on the other end that they say they are, or is it somebody misrepresenting who they are? And so I think as parents, we have to take the responsibility ourselves to get to know this whole other world that we didn't know as children ourselves, become familiar with it, and learn how we can help keep our kids safe, and set some limits about that. Having computers in a central place in the house, so you can go on and you can look over their shoulder and see who they're talking to and what they're saying, and checking pictures to make sure they're appropriate, and all of those sorts of things.
I think that those are some excellent tips, and some experts even recommend locking the computers up, and you only have access to the computer when we say you have access to the computer. Jody from Duluth writes, how do you tell, actually she doesn't write because otherwise I wouldn't have the question, somebody else wrote it and handed it to me. How do you tell when normal teenage behavior turns to chemical dependency issues? And we had a similar question about mental health issues. Dan?
Often it's not initially clear. If you have a teen who will be forthcoming with you, the most obvious approach is ask, and ask in a caring, non-judgmental way. If you don't, I would use your parental authority to investigate strongly. We've been talking about media. You can get into the children's media and find out who they're talking to, talk to other parents, talk to their friends. Parents sometimes are reluctant to use that kind of authority to investigate what their kids are up to, but when it's something serious such as substance use, that often seems to me warranted.
And so, Sabrina, would you be recommending to a parent that they do things like search the teen's room, read the teen's journal?
I think, room searches are, if you have the suspicions, as Dan mentioned, that your teen is using substances, or, there's kind of some serious mental illnesses, I think absolutely that you're searching the room and you're trying to find out what's going on. And it's again back to what Jane mentioned earlier about you're not your child's friend at this point in time. And so how do you, that going ahead and doing those things, which are sometimes really hard for parents and about invading their child's privacy, but on the other hand, the risks of missing or acting upon your suspicions are pretty high.
And I like to tell parents that if you're going to search your child's room, you can do it with your child present. Absolutely. So that the searching itself is not the secret, and is done maybe in a caring way. We don't have a lot of time. One more question, and how do I teach my teen to be more responsible, Jane?
Well, it helps if, as a parent, we are responsible. Can we lead? Lead by example, set the example, and it takes time. The kids, again, are they're not so focused on what they should be doing. They're out for what they want to be doing, and sounds fun, and my friends are doing this, and so really it is about setting some boundaries and setting limits with our kids and holding them to that, and then setting the example for them. I think that's the key part.
We are out of time. I think this could have easily been an hour show. And I think tonight's show was proof that a great show is made up of great guests. Thank you very much. And what's the take-home message here? I think the take-home message is that in the beginning, when your kids are younger, your job is to hold on to them and to hold them up and to hold them in the universe. As they get to be teenagers, your job is to let go so that when they're adults, you get to hang around with them. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links, and read my blog, the place where I answer more of your questions, and there will be some I will be answering. You can also email us your questions about next week's show, when we'll be talking about abusive relationships. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.